Welcome to the Virtuality Podcast. This is Craig Herndon with Jason Parks and Academy Award winner Ross Shain. Ross, thank you for coming on the show and joining us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's great to be with you guys.
So let's just jump right into it, and because I think anyone who clicks on this episode is probably going to be most interested in the Academy Award part. If you want to go into how you were selected for it and what that experience was like of actually receiving a 24-karat gold award.
Yeah, sure. Well, so I basically I'm from the visual effects sort of post-production side of the industry. I've been doing this for almost 25 years. And for the last 15 years, I've worked with a small team of developers. Originally, we were called Imagineer Systems. And this was a small team based in the UK that wrote some software that's used for motion tracking and for visual effects. And I'm sure we'll get into it, but basically the product, the commercialization of this software was called Mocha. And it's been used on a lot of feature films over the last 10, 15 years. Probably one of the most famous, projects it was used on was the early Harry Potter films. Yep. And our software was used to track like all the paintings in Hogwarts, for example, and to apply, all the paintings in Hogwarts. If you look in the background, they're actually moving, right, really subtly.
Yeah.
They've inserted actors and creating the illusion that these paintings have, all come to life. Our software we developed the software with a company, a UK visual effects house. They were sort of our original test pilots, I guess, because they were working on Harry Potter, and we actually had one of our developers in their offices. There's a company called Cinesite. And they would come to us with, here's a challenge, we have to track the motion of the way the camera's moving, but all these students are in front of the paintings. So that's like a very typical visual effects challenge in motion tracking. And so we kind of came up with a concept that we call planar tracking. And ultimately, the software has been used for, like I said, between the last 10 and 15 years on tons of visual effects films, up to the point where about, I guess it was 2013, we were actually contacted by a guy who's on the Academy's Science and Technical Board. And he said, I love what Mocha does, and I think that you guys, that it's unique enough and solves enough problems for the film industry that you guys should submit for a Sci-Tech Award. And if you don't know what the Sci-Tech Awards, anyone's listening to this, that's when you're watching the Academy Awards and they say, and usually they'll have some actress or actor come on and say, last week I presented at the Science and Technology Awards luncheon, and they'll usually just show a couple stills from that. But still, it was very, very exciting for us. And to get there, we had to go out to Los Angeles and do a whole pitch. And there's a pretty in-depth vetting process where the people on the committee really take it quite seriously, and they're not going to just give this award to anyone. So they, we were actually showing our software right next to the team from Industrial Light and Magic and some and Weta, Peter Jackson's company. So because there's a lot of these big visual effects studios have their own proprietary software. So anyways, ultimately it was a really exciting time, and they did acknowledge and pick our software as for the contribution it's made in the film industry. And it's very gratifying that our software's been used on so many famous films.
Yeah, and as far as like the list of films there, I believe Black Swan is one of them. Is that? Yeah. The
Natalie Portman film that was. It's kind of fun for us because if we look back at almost every feature film that was nominated for Best Visual Effects, really, I would say in the last 8 years has used some of our software on that film.
That's impressive.
Yeah. In fact, like for Black Swan, the premise is that Natalie Portman is a ballet dancer, right? And she, at the end of the film, she actually sort of turns into a swan. And there's a really amazing transformation sequence. And one of the visual effects artists who was tasked with tracking the actress and kind of morphing her and turning her into the swan, he found that he tried almost every different tracking technique and software and that's out there, and he kind of landed on Mocha, the tool that we developed, as the one that could help him solve the challenge the quickest. So that was really cool. Another fun one to think about is there's a film called Birdman, which actually won the Academy Award. Maybe this is probably about 4 years ago. It was Michael Keaton. He played a sort of reluctant superhero. And at the time, it was kind of funny because the way that film was marketed, it was almost like marketed sort of like an Alfred Hitchcock kind of like, this is all one take kind of film. But actually it was not all one take. So they used our software quite a lot to make all, to help make seamless transitions from one camera. Basically the camera's following the actors through this theater in almost real time. And, they're going down the halls and entering different rooms, and then the camera will swing around, and there's a lot of mirrors in the shot.
Stabilization's probably a big issue there, right?
Yeah, stabilization definitely, as well as just object removal, because there's a lot of reflective surfaces, and like you're in the backstage of a Broadway theater, so there's a lot of mirrors, in the cast.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. So you'll get the cast in the shot, or the film crew in the shot, because of the mirrors.
That's correct. Yeah. You see the camera itself or the crew. So there's quite a lot of post work to what we call invisible effects. You wouldn't think some of these things are basically visual effects, but anytime that you're doing any kind of image manipulation, we're pretty much calling that a visual effect.
Now, Ross, what are some of your favorite scenes from the movies that you've been able to work on?
Some of my favorite scenes. Well, I'm a kind of a big fantasy dork, so definitely some of the Harry Potter, famous Harry Potter scenes, and I love to see the before and the afters. We're lucky enough that we get to see some of these as the films were being made, or after we get to see some of the shots. So, some of the scenes from the Harry Potter films, definitely really cool to see. Even get to see, seeing Ralph Fiennes as Voldemort, right?
Yeah.
Kind of like, there's a mix of CGI and practical makeup, and then a lot of post work. So it's really cool to see the behind the scenes of that kind of shots, where our software might actually be used to remove the seams of a mask, for example. It's used quite a bit in the sense that people think of like Photoshop has become like almost like a verb, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where we say, "Oh, that was Photoshopped."
Yep.
In the same sense, when cleanup is done over time, a lot of that time they're using Mocha to assist with that process. So that's kind of neat. But yeah, Harry Potter, all the Marvel films pretty much. So recently I was at a trade show, and an artist came up to me. He said, "Hey, I just used Mocha on Black Panther." And that's
that's awesome.
It's great to that the product, we're a very small company still. So it's really cool that artists from all over the world are using the tool, on these high profile projects.
So for you, like when you watch these movies, is it difficult for you to leave your like how it's done side of, right? Where you like your suspension of disbelief is it hard to have that when you're looking at it being like, oh, I know how they did that. Oh, that was a cool.
Are you asking, are movies ruined for you?
Yeah.
Not exactly. I mean, I'm like I said, I'm a big fantasy nerd and can I appreciate a good story and I have a young daughter and we love to go see sci-fi and fantasy films and animation. So I definitely have the ability to lose myself. However, I would say that if something's not done really well, it can take me out of it because I pretty quickly, even if I'm not looking for it, if there's like a bad track or a bad mask, where you're seeing some fringing on the edges, those kind of things can, take me out of it. Personally, I guess if it's more like if I'm seeing something on television as opposed in the theater, I think, we all have that kind of that theater experience where I think we're more our sense of disbelief in fantasy is it's much easier to go to that place when you're watching in a theater, whereas if you're watching at home on a smaller screen, it's kind of fun actually to see some of the history of films that were in our childhood, or my childhood anyways, were cutting edge, right? Like the original Star Wars. If you look at that, you see lots of really noticeable errors in the visual effects that they did.
Very true.
So yeah, no, it's a good question.
And I guess like along that Star Wars is just like, did they even have the technology to fix those kinds of errors back then? Like, yeah,
so that's a good question. So like the history of effects in film is really rich and very interesting. A lot of the visual effects in the traditional filmmaking was done practically, meaning they did it in camera, right? So, on the Star Wars films, or even way before that, 2001, and even going back to the history of like early films, like King Kong and, early stop motion, all these things, they were done pretty much in camera. If you think about Star Wars, it was a lot of miniatures, right? So, and a lot of models. This is before computer graphics. So every time you see those kind of space scenes and spaceships and things like that, that's actually a miniature model. And there's fantastic, behind the scenes, that you can see. A lot of the techniques were developed to do things to basically to break the scene or to create fake backgrounds. A lot of that was actually painted by hand. So, before you could use computer graphics to create a full background, whatever magical place location that you're in, they would actually, very, very talented artists would create matte paintings on glass, really. And they'd actually, parts of the scene would be matted out so that you'd shoot through the glass and capture the real location. And then part of it would actually be the glass, the painting itself. So that was called matte painting. There's techniques that were designed that, where everything was shot on film in these days. There's a machine called an optical printer, where you take multiple passes of film and sort of pack them together and then reshoot them with another camera. And so that was kind of before green screens. That was a way that you could combine multiple locations or multiple elements onto screen at once. So yeah, there is a very, very rich history of technology in film and different ways to develop tools to help tell the stories.
And so like as this technology developed, you get our modern stack of Autodesk, Final Cut, Avid. Like, what are these missing that Boris FX comes in and adds value for these artists?
Yeah, so we're at a point today where everyone knows that editing, video editing is pretty ubiquitous, right? It's basically free, right? It comes, every laptop comes with some form of editing software. And then there's more professional tools where you have something from either Avid or Adobe or Autodesk, or at this point there's quite a lot of different host softwares, and there's always the battle for who will win the editing or the visual effects host. That's sort of an ongoing competition in the commercial software world. So yeah, all these tools have pretty in-depth tools. Adobe, for example, has become probably in the last couple of years the most popular applications. Premiere and After Effects together, Premiere for editing and After Effects for visual effects and animation. But these tools are designed to serve a very wide community, if that makes sense, right? So you might have someone who's editing weddings, and then on the low end, someone's editing weddings, or a student, or someone who's putting stuff up on YouTube without much visual effects or finishing considerations, and then you might have at the high end, someone who's working on a feature film or a television show. So because that some of these hosts have to fulfill a lot, they basically have to serve a huge audience. There are definitely specialty aspects that a company like ourselves, like Boris FX, will fill in the gaps, and we'll kind of look at areas that the tools don't focus on, and kind of explore how we can sort of make very task-specific tools. So motion tracking is a great example of that. Whereas, Adobe has motion tracking, and Autodesk has motion tracking, and, even Final Cut or Apple Motion has a little bit of motion tracking, but they're kind of simplified tools. Whereas our tool is kind of designed to handle very complex challenges that a professional might have to do to make something look perfect.
We talked a little bit already about like removing objects and stabilization, but whether like it makes a difference whether you're editing in like mono versus stereoscopic. Are those different challenges for you to solve based on like what kind of footage it is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, pretty much so far we're mostly talking about just regular film and video. We haven't really talked about like VR 360, but when stereoscopic filmmaking, basically, there was a time in the 50s, right, where they had 3D films. And then about, I don't know, at this point, when did Avatar came out? It must have been about 8-10 years ago. When Avatar came out, sort of kicked off a sort of mini revolution of stereoscopic films, 3D films, making it back to the theater. And we all know nowadays, most of the big tentpole films, like Marvel films, have a stereo version out in the theater. When Avatar came out, all of a sudden, a lot of customers were coming to us and saying, we'd like Mocha to work for stereo. And what stereo really means in a sort of layman's terms, if you're thinking about how the software or how you would manipulate the images, you literally have a view for your right eye and a view for your left eye. And removing an object or tracking an object or even just masking. When I say masking, it's sort of like segmenting or drawing a shape around an image to remove it from its background. You have to do all that work on both eyes. And if the footage is moving, that gets pretty complex. So because we have sort of like the backbone algorithms and technology to track pixels, we were able to get to stereo and create some pretty useful tools for the market for stereoscopic rotoscoping and masking and tracking, that kind of thing. So yeah, stereo is a really interesting area for us. And some of our customers have been doing stereo conversions. So even some of these films I mentioned, like when you go to see, Black Panther in 3D, for example, or, any of those Marvel films that you see in a theater in 3D, they're actually shot with just one lens, not with a stereoscopic camera these days. And then they're post-converted. So they're literally companies that specialize in converting a 2D film into 3D. It's very, very labor intensive, and it takes a lot of artists because they're literally segmenting or isolating almost every part of the scene. There's depth, And then they're kind of using some modern techniques to, if you kind of think of taking pixels and almost dragging them towards the screen, or imagine the screen as a rubber band, or a plastic wrap, right? You're kind of taking pixels and pulling them towards you. They're kind of using sort of techniques like that, where even a person might be segmented into 50 to 100 layers and really isolated, so that the director can control how much depth is going to be seen in the scene. It's really kind of interesting to think about, because there's actually on set and in the post part of the stereo world, there's stereographer is the title, and that's the person whose job is just to be on top of the depth of the film, and to work with the director to sort of like how you can really even change the story and how a viewer can perceive things by changing the depth. When you see an object in back of you, for example, if you see an object in the background, just changing the relationship in 3D to how close that object is to the foreground elements, that can totally change the story. So it's very interesting stuff to think about.
It sounds like Mocha's been used on a lot of these films. Could we talk a little bit about implementation for 360 video?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, we kind of developed Mocha as this tool to solve a lot of problems for film and for video creators, the motion tracking and removing objects, things like that. And then as we developed, we kind of just looked at new formats, so I mentioned stereoscopic. When that sort of new format came to fruition, our user base asked us to get into it. So about 3.5 years ago, someone actually came up to us, one of our customers, and he actually showed us a very early implementation of 360 video. And this is a guy named Jürgen, who created a company called Freedom 360. He was actually 3D printing his own 360 camera rigs, where he would take 6 GoPros and combine them together into this custom 3D printed rig. And then what that would sync these 3 different cameras together into like a spherical capture system. That footage would be then stitched together, and then so then a user actually could look through or pan around or have a 360 spherical experience with this footage. He came up to us actually, and he said, I've heard about Mocha, and you guys have a great reputation for tracking. One of the issues that I'm having is I need to stabilize this footage. And he showed me some footage of himself walking on the Great Wall of China. And the footage itself was a little bit jittery. And as we know, that's probably the number one thing that people struggle with when they put on a headset, a VR headset, is if they're looking at something that was shot with a camera, is if the footage is not very stable, they're very easily, someone could get motion sickness or feel nauseous. Their equilibrium is off, and they're going to have a bad experience. So Jürgen asked us, hey, is there a way that you could use Mocha to stabilize this? And pretty quickly we just looked at it and said, yeah, those are the fact that they're in a spherical format didn't really matter to us. We're kind of just looking at the pixel patterns, because that's really what we do, is we track pixel patterns. And so we said, yeah, we certainly could stabilize that. And a couple months later, it just sort of like kismet, more and more customers were asking or sort of giving us the idea that, hey, 360 video and VR is coming. We heard about early versions of Oculus before Facebook bought them, and sort of that gave us the go ahead. There was enough buzz around this, in an early way, that we think that there's something there. So that we looked at the 360 format, and we saw what some of the visual effects houses were doing to deal with these challenges. And we were seeing very, very complex and manual, laborious techniques were being used to stabilize and to stitch and to do things like that. So that gave us the go ahead. And I guess at this point, it was just over a year, or last February, we came to market with Mocha VR, the first version, which is essentially our software, the Mocha software, which is optimized now to work in a spherical space. And it solves a lot of issues for post-production. And it's become a very successful product for us. And in fact, we've won a couple of awards for that software as well since we released it.
Now, is the same team that created Mocha the same team that created Mocha VR, or did you have to bring more people on, or what's the team flow like for you guys?
Yeah, pretty much it's the same. It's the same core team. I mean, we have a small but pretty nimble team. About really about 6 or 7 developers and a couple of product specialists, and we all work together closely. I come from sort of like bridge the gap between the creative visual effects supervisor and the developer. So it's a real team effort to try to solve the problems, because sometimes the developer might have an idea. One of the developers might have an idea how to solve the problem, but it might not be exposed in a good way for a creative mind to actually use the tool. And vice versa, sometimes someone like myself, who's more on the creative side, will say, hey, the tool should do this, this, and this. And it's a little bit of a give and take, and a real collaboration with the computer vision developers, computer researchers, and C++ coders to come up with the tools to solve the problem.
And as far as like the types of problems, like, so you mentioned this scenario earlier with like the Great Wall of China. So I could see in a problem like that, you have like the horizon, and it'll almost look as if it's curved, right? And then Mocha, you're able to go in there and actually make that horizon horizontal almost, and it'll actually look natural.
Yeah, that's correct. So essentially, when people these 360 creators are shooting with a 360 camera, the footage is stitched together, right? So you have, most of these cameras have multiple cameras, from 6 to 8 to many cameras that are all synced together and taken together. And then, when you're moving this spherical camera through space, because as we know, if the camera is static on a tripod, it's not going to be the most immersive experience. Essentially when you put on your headset, you're going to feel like you are the tripod. You can turn around, but you're not going to feel like you're really in space. So that's why a lot of these 360 creators are putting their cameras on drones or sliders or wires or all kinds of moving devices, because they want to basically guide the viewer through the environment. Obviously, it's not going to be as immersive as a 3D generated, and we'll get to some of those ideas. A 3D generated experience, right? But that's why they're moving the cameras to create these immersive experiences. But yeah, absolutely. If the horizon's not feeling stable, and little jitters, the camera's not all positioned in the same way. These are the kind of things that the viewer can really bother the viewer, and ultimately will give 360 video and immersive video and VR a bad name if there's a lot of bad content out there. So we developed a very simple way that the user can just select a portion of the screen. So say, a portion on the horizon, and you just basically hit track forwards, and we analyze those pixels. And if you kind of think of, sort of use the ball or the sphere metaphor, if you think of, say you had a tennis ball, and the logo of the tennis ball was that mountain range. And if you were spinning that all around, we're basically taking that logo and putting it right to the center position in every frame. So we're stabilizing the relationship between you as the viewer who's in the center and that horizon or the logo. So what's interesting is in the non-360 world, stabilization techniques have been around for a long time. But what happens is when you stabilize traditional video, you end up getting black borders on the sides, and then you have to blow up the screen. scale the image to keep all, good pixels in the screen. When you're working in 360, you are in a seamless environment. So essentially, just think of that the center of the sphere, that we are in the center of the sphere, and we can look up and down. We have access to all these pixels. So we're just basically, once we understand the way a pixel moves across the screen, we can reposition it and kind of slide it back and keep it locked down in place.
Yeah, that is just super impressive. So we'll definitely have to have a link to some of these features in the show notes. So the other like types of cameras. So we just talked about like 360 and GoPro. What about like a 180?
Yeah, there's a bunch of new 180 cameras that have come out recently. Zcam is a company, and Kando is another company. Yeah, we're beginning to see a lot of new cameras come out right now. In fact, Facebook announced at the F8 conference 2 weeks ago or something. They announced a collaboration with Red, which is Red makes cinema quality cameras that many of the feature films that we see in the theaters today are shot on. And Red had actually stayed out of they really hadn't done anything with 360, and now it sounds like Red is getting into the game as well. So yeah, it's been interesting because we've seen very quickly a time where it was almost like these cameras were created by hobbyists who are taking traditional 2D cameras and creating their own, rigs in their own ways to stitch the footage together. Very quickly, within the space of 2 years, all of a sudden, many of the players, large players, are getting into the 360 camera, camera business. As well as some of the companies I mentioned, like Zcam or Kanda. These are Chinese companies that are really killing it. They're bringing really powerful cameras to market at a really affordable price.
Is there an arms race between Mocha and some of the others to try and meet the demand for these features as these new devices come out and new ways of filming, recording, editing, and just like the needs of the users change?
There is and there isn't. And I think that's actually a really interesting thing is that there's definitely many more cameras available. If you're someone who wants to get into shooting 360 video and creating content for a headset, right now you could probably choose from, 30 different kinds of cameras on market or more. Whereas in the post-production tools world, there's really not that much happening right now. So you have Adobe has some tools, you have Apple has some integrated tools, and then on the high end you have Nuke, for example, is a very famous visual effects tool that has their own VR 360 tools as well. But there's really not that many tools available, and I think that's probably the biggest hurdle for the users who are trying to get into the space. Is because the cameras are so affordable. Right now you could go buy a Insta camera for your iPhone for like $100, $200. You could be shooting 360 video right with your iPhone. But then what are you going to do with that footage beyond just upload it to YouTube? Are you going to add titles to it? Are you going to edit it? Are you going to color correct it? Are you going to fix all the errors? That's the interesting time right now, I think and that's an area, truthfully, that is very of interest to me as someone who wants to see 360 content take off. Not only because obviously I make software for it, but just I think it's cool and exciting. Definitely educating the users on how to do more, and especially because, like I said, a lot of people can get into they can access these cameras very easily, but then the post-production part of it is not that easy. So
right,
it's an interesting.
And it seems to me like, so when you go to film 360, it's an entire new medium for a lot of creatives as they get into it. So I think you see this rather commonly where they'll go in and record like outside and maybe spend $100,000, $150,000 on a set. But then they come to you screaming that there's all this stuff in their shot that they weren't even aware because they weren't thinking about it when they were filming, just because of the way the camera is. So, for example, in one of your videos, there's the van that's going along, and in the shot is the shadow of not only the tripod but like also the camera too, and then of course all the dust and everything. So there's that aspect of it, but some will even have like the film crew is in the shot and they didn't realize it.
Yes, absolutely. Like, so removing objects that's if you look at on YouTube, for example, and you search for 360 video, you're going to find tons and tons of video where if you look straight down, all they've done is taken a logo and put it on top of where the camera is, or maybe it's just a big blurred area, right? So what we can do with our software is we can actually remove the camera using this aspect of our software we developed to remove wires for stunts. I call it content aware on steroids. Basically, it's sort of like to use a Photoshop analogy, where you're removing objects from the scene, but we're taking frames in time and finding the software auto detects the clean areas in time and auto patches the objects that you don't want out. This is a huge time saver, and something, especially since these footage files could be 4K or 8K. They're very, very large image files. Could be very, very time consuming to paint them out or to do that kind of thing. So this is another area that we're really focusing on, is just teaching people how they can remove the unwanted elements to kind of create more immersive experiences.
Do you plan to release like a set of best practices to where, like, one example would be anytime you're going to put your tripod down, first get a reference shot of what's under it, so that way Mocha can come in and use that as a reference?
Yeah, that's if you're moving the camera through a scene, the more clean references that we have, that's going to help us. So yeah, and sometimes I'll even suggest that even if you're not shooting, like, just say the floor, where when you look down and you see the floor, that reference does not even have to be shot with the 360 camera. That could be shot with a traditional camera or your phone camera, as long as it's high enough resolution. Just getting more references of the actual environment is going to help. If you know your crew, your camera crew is going to be in a particular place. Like you want to put your camera crew, like, have them all kind of huddle up against the wall, because then it's very easy to patch that wall back on top of them and kind of just basically hide them from the shot. Whereas you would not want to put your crew in front of a moving tree that's moving in the wind, because then you can't patch them out in the same way. So just thinking about the set and thinking about kind of breaking the set in your mind into sort of like, what's the area of focus, and where are some of the areas that we can kind of hide things is definitely a good best practice kind of thing to think about.
And as far as outside of Mocha, in thinking of best practices, what other products do you have that can kind of help users along?
Yeah, sure. So Boris FX is our parent company. They acquired the Mocha team about 3 years ago. And Boris FX has been making plugins for video editors for many, many years that work inside of, Adobe and Avid and all the various editing systems. Recently, Boris FX, kind of following the success of Mocha VR, came out with something called the Continuum VR unit. And we kind of looked at some of the filters that we have in the Continuum package and said, what would be the most applicable thing that a 360 creator would need? So a good example of that is we have a really great filter called Magic Sharp, which is a sharpening filter that can take a video image and basically bring back detail without aliasing. A lot of sharpened filters that you'll see, once you start, it almost becomes a battle, because you're sort of like crushing the blacks and the contrast. but you'll start seeing like aliasing happening on the edges. So Magic Sharp has pretty a lot of parameters to tune your sharpening. So that's included in the VR unit, and it's optimized for 360 video. A lot of traditional video filters, when you apply them to 360 video, what happens is they don't tile correctly across the scene. So we've taken some of the filters from the Continuum unit and Continuum product, and optimized them for 360. So like a blur will blur in the full spherical video, or insert filter, for example, is a way to add graphics to your footage. So yeah, the Continuum VR unit. In fact, I'm not sure when this will actually be available for our users to listen to, but it's free. We're actually giving it away free. It's 5 free filters in the month of May. So hopefully, if this gets online in the next week or two, there's an opportunity for the users to download that for free.
Excellent. We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah.
Now, do you feel like your users ever take your products and utilize them in ways that you would have never imagined? I know that happens a lot in the music industry, where you might have a sound library or some kind of effects plugin that gets utilized by an artist and takes it to a whole nother level. Have you seen that?
Yeah, all the time. And that's probably the funnest part about what we do, is when we see that, some creative person has taken a tool and, used it in a different kind of way than we originally thought about it. An example of this, not really for 360 or VR, but is because we can basically track shapes across the scene. Sometimes we'll actually see users who use this for animation, and create really, really unique looks. Like there was a film called Scanner Darkly a couple of years, Philip K. Dick film, that had a real, it's called, it's like a roto motion kind of look, where it looks like it's hand drawn, but at the same time, it's almost like too realistic to be hand drawn. We've seen a lot of projects using our software to create those kind of looks, which is really cool. Or even like, if you think that everything that we do is motion tracking, and you can use it to stabilize. Recently, the Stephen King It film, yep. They actually created a really interesting look that the villain or the clown, they stabilized his face to the screen, and the rest of the screen is moving all around, but only his face is like looking, is locked down. And it's like you could use these tools for creative purposes in a way that the developers didn't necessarily even think of them.
Oh, I remember that. That was terrifying.
Yeah, Pennywise the clown.
Yeah, Pennywise, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I am not good with horror films at all. Especially like jump scares, they just scare like right at like, especially in like VR, even like left hand path.
Like, how about the Paranormal Activity? Have you tried that in VR?
Don't plan to.
It's definitely interesting, because we're definitely seeing that in the narrative space. That the horror and audio, plays really, really well in VR. We have some friends, these guys in LA. They're called Light Sail VR, and they have a project that is called Speak of the Devil. And it's really cool because it's a combination of shot on video, but they've also included a whole interactive choose your own adventure. It's almost like a Blair Witch Project combined with a choose your own adventure, where you can you're in this environment out in the woods and with some people, and they're actually addressing the camera as if it's a character. So you are a character. And then that scene will stop, and then you get arrows on screen. Because they combined, they combined the video assets with Unity to make an interactive project.
Oh, very nice.
So then you can actually click forward, or you can look around. You could bring up a map, or you can go back in time. So that it's really cool. I think there's like 21 paths to it. So it's scary too.
Yeah, interactive 360 content is very interesting to me. So what I've seen it most successfully done is where the 360 is more of a backdrop. with the virtual elements that you're interacting with. So you're like in the center of the photo, right? But everything you're interacting with is all virtual, and you don't actually really interact with the photo itself, right? Or the video, but you interact with like just what's in front of you. So I really do want to see what creatives do next in that space. Have you seen any other kind of trends in that space, or anything from other partners?
Yeah, I think that people, we're sort of seeing like second wave of content, technology and content happening where, the creators are really exploring a cross between 3D assets and 2D assets and combining them in the same space. Another company that we visited recently is a company called Riot. Yeah. They're out in Los Angeles as well. And they originally, I believe, were big in 360 like journalism. I think their founder was just like, he's like an outdoorsman journalist kind of guy, would, go to war zones with his camera and that kind of thing. But they're getting into narrative content as well. They're coming out with I haven't seen the project yet. The trailer is online. It's called Door Number One. And it's being distributed by Hulu, which I think is very, very interesting because that's, a big traditional media company, that's partnered with all the networks. And they're coming out with a 360 immersive series. And the guys from Riot told me that they used our tools to actually to rotoscope and track actors so that you can actually click on actors. So they brought the 2D assets into Unity. And so it's kind of, again, it's like that kind of combining the some of the tools are used from the video game space or from the immersive space with more traditional Hollywood, acting and camera making. So I think there's, it's definitely going to be an exciting time to start seeing more of this kind of content.
So what is one of your most favorite experiences that you've done and seen in 360 so far?
Well, I was out at South by Southwest in March, and that was a really great time because they have sort of like a whole virtual area where you can kind of go from one experience to the next experience, and really get to see a lot of the sort of cutting edge stuff. This was right when that Wes Anderson film, The Island of Dogs, came out. And I'm a big fan of Wes Anderson, and I'm a huge fan of stop motion in general, stop motion animation. So
Fantastic Mr. Fox,
yeah,
Moonrise
exactly.
Kingdom.
Yeah. So I love this kind of look that he's kind of come up with. And so one of our a customer called Felix and Paul, these are a company based in Montreal. They're very, very creative company doing 360 immersive content.
Beautiful work.
Yeah, really beautiful work.
Like, even just going to the website, you're just like, whoa.
Yeah, and they're definitely coming at it from a artistic point of view. Definitely. I think they've done a lot of work with the Cirque du Soleil and different companies. Maybe it's a French Canadian thing, but. But they did a project for Island of Dogs, which was just really beautiful. Essentially, the Island of Dogs film is a stop motion film. But imagine that you put the headset on and you're in the animator's studio, and that you're actually, rather than you're yourself, you're a person, your world view is like. It's almost like you are at the eye level of the dog puppets, the dog characters, and I think what's really incredibly successful about that project for me is you see so much 360 where you're just like in immersive content where they're trying, the content itself is trying to recreate how a human sees something, right? They're trying to put us. On a hang glider, or put us, in some dangerous place on a roller coaster, or whatever, right? Or in a battle, even if it's a game. But the cool thing about this was like you're on the animation stand, and you're kind of like the puppets, the stop motion characters are talking to you.
Yeah.
But when
or like for the voice actor even.
Yes. Yeah. Right. And then you would turn your head and you'd look around and you'd actually see. Much bigger is the animator itself in time lapse, and you could really get a sense of like how much work went into this film, where they're hand animating the dogs. But it's also a combination of like, wow, this is a really cool experience. I'm just kind of looking at the dog itself. And I just love that the play on space. And to me, that's like the most magical thing that I think, putting on a headset can bring you is just take you to a place that you couldn't normally go to. So
exactly. And like for Ready Player One, Steven Spielberg actually had the set in VR to where the actors could put on the headset and see what the characters would be seeing in a given scene for some specific scenes. So that way you could have like a better idea of what's around you and the spatial aspects that are around you. So that way when you move, you see, because even when you take the headset off, right, and you're actually filming, we're really good at remembering where something is. So if you take off a headset after coming out of a VR experience, you'll be like, oh, there's a treasure chest over there, and like to my right is this couch. But if you take it off, and if you still try and think of you're in that area, you'll know when to stop or where that couch is, right? So it actually sped up production because the actors were more aware of their virtual surroundings instead of just blindly acting into a green screen.
Right. Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And we're seeing actually a trend in filmmaking where things like, technology that's coming from VR and game engines and, we mentioned Unity and things like that are actually making it onto set and empowering the filmmakers and the actors to see things in real time in a way that they might have in the past, even a couple of years ago, they might be acting in a big green screen with no reference at all. And now they actually can, like you say, put on a headset or even see on a monitor in real time, like what the background's going to look like. So, these tools are are kind of being pushed in many different directions right now.
Are there other problems that you're seeing coming up in the industry that just aren't solvable yet, but that there's a desire out there to solve?
Well, I think that there's a couple of holy grail, areas in the visual effects and post world. One is simply segmentation. The ability to isolate every single object on screen without shooting on a green screen, and have that cleanly done and have that done via computer software and not by an artist. That we sort of look at that as like one of the holy grail areas that would be used not only for visual effects, but for many, many different things. I mean, if you can imagine watching any video on YouTube and being able to click on almost anything in the scene and have it tagged to drive whether it was commerce or, information, that kind of thing. Segmentation is a huge area that, although we've done a lot of research and certainly lots of companies and lots of different, research projects and schools have been doing a lot of research into that. It's definitely not solved yet. So yeah, automatic segmentation is one. Probably the biggest thing is the push towards holographic imagery, right? That's the other, where the Star Wars generation and everyone wants to see those holograms pop off, and we're not there yet, obviously.
Yeah, as you just mentioned, Star Wars generation, and meanwhile, Beat Saber is like #1 highest ranked game of all time. And that's more than just because of Star Wars, but that definitely helped the marketing of it.
Those lightsabers! Who doesn't want a lightsaber?
Right. We've been waiting for that, and Beat Saber is right now known to giving you the feeling of having that, and it does it in a rhythmic experience that is definitely unique. So going back to just Mocha, is there any low-hanging fruit that you're working towards right now?
Yeah, I mean, there's, basically we've always kind of like looked at taking tasks that are difficult, or maybe taking like a 5-step task and making it a couple, 2 clicks instead of 5 clicks, We're always looking for ways to save the artist time, so ultimately they can just spend time being creative and not getting bogged down in sort of the minutia of keyframing and manually sliding, making manual choices on screen. I guess the low-hanging fruit is really just to make the tools even easier to use. Because we are doing some complex things, that might take many steps. Just trying to solidify the interface in different ways that we can kind of create shortcuts and make it more user friendly. That's always I guess I would call that low-hanging fruit. The more we can improve the interface and the experience for the customer, that's certainly stuff that's going to be useful. One thing that we have in development right now, which is very exciting, is we've talked a little bit about object removal. Where the software analyzes the frames and finds clean areas in time. That's an area that we've focused on for a long time, but we've never had the algorithms running on the GPU. It's always been computer-based, CPU-based. So now we actually have this running on GPU hardware, and that's really where the massive developments are happening in hardware is GPU cards and NVIDIA. So we can do 360 object removal 10 to 20 times faster than the existing Mocha VR, and that's less than a year later.
Yeah.
So that's
huge.
Yeah, that's definitely huge because as I sort of said earlier, 360 post it can be frustrating and time consuming for users, especially when you're working at 8K and a lot of processing. So the faster that we can solve these problems, that's definitely going to be things that the customers are interested in.
And how much time does it take to remove a standard object, maybe like the size of a chair, in then a video?
Yeah, it really depends on the resolution of the frame, whether it's HD or to 8K. But as far as the render process, again, that's something that could take. It could take a second per frame, or it could go all the way up to 10 to 15 seconds of processing per frame, because what we're doing is we're analyzing all these frames in time. So if you're analyzing a 10-minute shot for every single frame that you want to replace, then it could take a lot of time. So there's ways that we can kind of that's another sort of bit that the more optimization that we can do so that the software is intelligent enough to find the clean areas. That's again stuff that we're working on right now.
Do you feel like the team as it is now, the team that you have, is capable of handling? Because this is a lot of work. It sounds like you guys are doing. Are you looking to expand your team and grow, or are you able to handle this with what you have?
I think we have a sweet spot where we have a very strong team, but we're not too big that it's manageable. Occasionally, we're looking for senior people, but I think we're in a good position right now. Again, we are a commercial company, and there's that relationship to maintaining profitability and the whole business dance that you have to do is part of the whole equation. So I think we're in a good position right now to continue to solve problems, but not grow too fast.
And if people wanted to find out more about Mocha and Boris FX, where should they go and how can they contact you?
Yeah, sure. So you can check out borisfx.com, and that's kind of our homepage where we have a whole section about Mocha and about Continuum and Sapphire, our main products. There's a whole Mocha VR page. And then we're also pretty active on social media. So, if you go to Facebook, type in Boris FX, or even type in Mocha, you'll find pages for various products and things like that. So, yeah, I definitely encourage anyone who's interested in the software to take a look. And
are there trainings people can take to get up to speed?
Yeah, we offer. We have probably 300 different videos on our website that in the training section is tagged by subject. So if you want to learn about the VR tools, just type in VR. If you want to learn about, how to add titles, just type in titles. So yeah, you'll find lots of free videos, and as well as we do have paid training classes where you could buy, you could download a series like an intro to Mocha with about 10 videos, 10 hours of footage. So lots of different training opportunities.
Again, just thanks for coming on the show, and we'll see you in this reality
or the next. Thank you so much for listening. We would like to keep sharing more about VR and AR with you, so please consider a few dollars to our Patreon, linked in the show notes. The Virtuality Podcast is produced by Jason Parks and music by Rachel Dazinski. This podcast is in collaboration with Boston VR and Boston AR. Monthly meetups and events can be found on meetup.com. You can also follow us on Twitter @VirtualityCast and learn more at our website, virtuality.show.